Want to see something fantastic? Check it out. This shamisen is made with the highest level of tiger stripe figuring called tochi, from head to toe. Not only that, on the inside of the dough, called the nakago, this spike generally uses wood with less figuring because it can't be seen through the skins. Not with this shamisen though. This has just as much figuring on the nakago as it has on the sao and tenjin. Not only that, what makes this especially rare is that the shamisen is nobezao. That's right, this neck is made with one single chunk of the highest quality tochi kouki. That is pretty rare, and we think that when this was brand new, it would have easily costed $30,000 or more.
Dude!
However, taking a look at the top, this gnarly gash definitely lowers that price a notch or two. What is this? This ware is called Kanberi, and how it's formed is basically by the string digging into the wood and over years creating dips and grooves. Often Kanberi is seen on positions 3, 4, 6, 9, 10, 12, pretty much. Those are the most commonly played positions. This is quite different, given that the groove starts on position 1 and goes all the way to 16-ish. I can't imagine that's all done with years of sliding, so it feels more like a file or chisel that has been just run through. I don't know why. But whatever the case, it's a great opportunity to learn how to fix it. If there is kanberi, if there are these dips and grooves, what happens is the string will press into the dip and then the free end of the string will vibrate against the top of the dip. This can create a harsh, undesired buzzing sound. It can also drastically lower sustain and mute the subtler tonal qualities of shamisen. Now, of course, unlike a ruptured skin, kanberi on the sao won't prevent you from playing shamisen. However, if you want a used shamisen to sound brand new again, properly replaying it is essential. And if that sounds good to you, won't you please follow me into the workshop? Boing!
Okay, we're here in the workshop. The first thing we want to do is remove the kamigoma from the tenjin. Why? Well, if we shave wood from only this part of the saw, there will be more distance between the saw and the strings. Our goal is to make sure the string height remains the same after replaning as it was before. By evenly removing wood from both the saw and the area where the strings rest, we can maintain the same string height successfully. So with that understood, let's pop off the kamigoma. Note, you may have to use heat from a heat gun if the kamigoma is secured with superglue. This one isn't. Next, if your shamisen has a sawari device, like a azuma or en sawari, unscrew the unit from behind and remove the main mechanism. The sawari cage will remain glued in place for now. Next, let's put a straight edge on the saw, making sure that one end is resting on the edge where the kamigoma was, and the other end rests on the bottom edge of the saw. We're doing this to examine the relief, which is a slight 1 millimeter-ish concave curve on the top of the saw. There's plenty of guitar articles online for more info about relief, but to put it briefly, this curve adds a tiny amount of distance between the strings and the saw when the string is pressed down. This makes the tone clearer, and with the lower koma or neck angle, you can get a soft sawari-like buzz, which adds color to the tone. A well-made saw will have a smooth curve from the beginning of the sawari tani and ending at the end of the saw. The curve's lowest point is around position 10-12, roughly the middle of the saw, but the most important thing is to make the curve gradual and even. A sudden dip or rise can cause buzzing or intonation issues. The relief on this shamisen is very good, so I'll plane the saw evenly to maintain this exact curve. If your saw appears bumpy, you might need to sand more in a specific area to achieve a smooth curve. If it looks fine like this, you're good to go. Now that the kamigoma is off and the sawari device is removed, and we've checked the relief, it's time to prepare the shamisen, sal, for leveling. First, we need to separate the sal from the dough. Tap the nakago, this spike, against a hard surface, or in this case, a surface. Next, we want to ensure the sal is stable during work with no pressure put on the tenjin. Some craftsmen will use a padded vise and others will place it on their lap. Here's my method. First, I place the sal in a cradle made from a stack of old phone books. The books are soft and opening the top book creates a channel for the sal to rest in. Then I put a towel in between the books and the sal to collect the sawdust. I then make sure the sal is elevated enough so the tenjin is not touching the table. Next, I place strips of flat wood under the nakago joint. It should be thick enough that it's in contact with the bottom of the nakago joint when the sal is in the cradle. Next, I position a rubber-footed clamp on the top side of the nakago joint, tightening it just enough to keep the sal secure. There's no need for excessive clamping. It's just to prevent the sal from moving back and forth. As you tighten the clamp, make sure there's still distance between the tenjin and the table. Elevate the cradle a bit higher if needed. With our sal secure, it's time to sand or shave the top. So again, the wear is made by the string digging into the wood, which over years creates tiny valleys. By sanding or shaving the top side, we're simply lowering the surface of the sal until the valley is gone. But we want to do so evenly. For example, if there's Kanberi wear on only the top end of the sal, we still want to remove an equal amount of wood from the middle and bottom. Sanding only one part of the sal can create a height difference with the other part of the sal you didn't sand. And if the string hits that sudden rise in height, it can be a point of harsh buzzing. Next, let's quickly talk about the 3 tools we can use for surface wood removal. Shamisen makers typically use a standing plane called a dainal ganna with a reversed blade. Reversing the blade can shave the wood without risk of gouging or pulling up grain. While dainal ganna with reversed blades aren't available online, you can get a regular standing plane and reverse the blade yourself. Alternatively, the scraper blade, that is a viable option. For these 2 options, you should remove the sawari cage first, because again, this area of the tenjin will need to be leveled along with the rest of the sal, and running your plane or scraper on the metal cage will dull the blade. To remove it, you can use heat from a soldering iron to break the superglue bond, and then make a rectangular block shaped to the exact size of the sawari cage. Now you might be wondering, do I really need to make my own tap? Not necessarily. Ideally, you will have something that fits the contours that will ensure the cage will go straight through, but you can try other types of taps, as long as it's not sharp like a chisel and that it will touch at least 2 edges of the cage to push it through. So try something else if needed. Place the block right over the gold rectangle and tap on it with a hammer to pop the cage out of the hole. How do you know when the cage is ready to tap? Use your nose. The glue will smell when it gets hot. That's the time. Alternatively, if removing the cage is a hassle, you can keep it in place and scrape only the sal, then save the tension area for the next tool I'll mention. And that tool really is the easiest option for both replaning the sal and the tenjin. It's simply a flat block with sandpaper attached using double-sided tape. If the block is perfectly flat, it's a highly effective way to sand the surface evenly until the wear is gone. I recommend using an aluminum block, as there's no chance of it warping over time. But generally, a wood block is fine too. Just make sure it's flat as possible. For the sandpaper, if your sal has really heavy Kanberi wear, starting at 120 grit is fine. Of all these tools, I recommend the sandpaper block as it's the easiest and safest method to get good results. Now, with our tool of choice, evenly scrape, plane, or sand the saw until the Kanberi wear is no longer visible. Be sure to clear dust or debris often so you can see the status of your work. Be sure to equally sand the chibukuro area, ending just past the edge of the itogura, where the strings rest. If you lower the saw's surface by a millimeter, the chibukuro area must also lower a millimeter as well. Okay, we've sanded or shaved the saw until we don't see Kanberi anymore. Let's put a straight edge on top and check our relief. If you notice any bumps or rises along the saw, take this moment to shave or sand them out until you've got a smooth curve from sawari to the bottom. I'm happy with the relief on this saw, so let's move on to the next step, fine sanding and polishing. So, no matter what tool you used for Kanberi removal, we will switch to a flat block for fine sanding. And a note to those who remove the sawari cage, now would be the time to glue it back in. On the top side, there's usually a hairline gap between the cage and the wood. After the cage is glued in, add a tiny bit of superglue on the top to fill in the cracks. After it's soaked in for a few seconds, use an accelerant to harden the glue. If the metal protrudes past the surface, use a file to grind down the metal until it's flush with the tenji. In the fine sanding stage, I prefer to have a flat block, narrower than the width of the saw. Otherwise, it's easy to accidentally round the edges. Fundamentally, we want the widthwise surface to either be perfectly flat or just slightly concave, just 1/4 millimeter. You don't really have to stress about making it concave. I think it's really just the visual aesthetics, how the wood catches the light with that slight curve. Nothing wrong with that though. So with this narrower block, we'll evenly wet sand the saw with progressively higher grits of sandpaper. If you started with 120 grit, move on to 220, then 320, 400, 800, then 1000. If you used a plane or scraper, you might be able to start with 1000, but you have to be very sure your shaving was even and you didn't create any bumps. If you want to be safe, you could do a few passes starting from 220 just to even out any potential bumps. Quick warning, if you're sanding a mitsuori saw, be sparing with water around the joints. In general, it's good to use water as it prevents the sandpaper from clogging with the wood residue. But around the joints, loose water can carry the fine wood particles into the joints. And as it dries, the residue acts like a glue and it becomes very difficult to separate the joints. So just use a light wipe from a damp cloth around the joints. And then when sanding away from the joints, using more water is no problem. Alrighty, we've sanded up to 1000 grit. Wow, what a beauty. After the wood is dried, running your finger across should feel smooth and very delightful. Oh, at this point, if your dough has a skin on it, I'd recommend putting your shamisen together to test your work by gently playing every position from 1 to 21, one string at a time. Every note should be clear. Now, if the string height is low, you'll probably hear a gentle warm buzz on the ichinoito called sao nari, which has a similar quality as the sawari buzz. However, if you ever hear a particularly harsh buzz on a particular spot, that's a sign the sanding or planing was uneven. Mark those spots with a pencil and sand those spots with 320 grit sandpaper. Initially, focus your sanding on the pencil mark for a few strokes, and then widen the sanding strokes in order to feather. It's important to feather so that your corrective sanding doesn't unintentionally cause a sudden height difference elsewhere, which will create further buzzing. Then, sand to 400, 800, and 1000 grit and test the area again. When you've confirmed that the sound is as you like it, you can proceed to sand with 1200, 1500, and then 2000 grit. Depending on how much wood you removed, you might notice this area of the tenjin has flattened where it was rounded before. It's perfectly fine to keep it that way, and I think it looks pretty cool. But if you'd prefer it to be like how it was before, now would be the time to start rounding that area. Start just above the edge of the itogura, here, and run the sandpaper block over the edge of the flattened area, here, in order to feather the edge and gently round it out. You can start at 400 grit until it's rounded, and then continue through 800, 1000, 1200, 1500, and finish at 2000. After we've sanded to 2000, let's check out the sawari tani, the valley here. On a finished shamisen, the top line of the sawari tani is about 1 millimeter from the edge of the itogura, and the bottom line connects these 2 points. Depending on how much wood we've removed, the sawari tani will also shrink. As you can see, these edge lines have become much closer together. Well, we want to reset these edge lines. First, using a ruler or basically anything with a straight edge and a pencil, draw a line where you want the edges reset. Again, 1 millimeter from the edge of the itogura. And for the other, line up the straight edge with these 2 points. Now to deepen the valley and reset the edges, we need a flat block with the long side slightly rounded in order to match the curve of the original sawari tani before we started the kanberi removal. Like this. I recommend the block being slightly wider than the width of the 2 lines, because that makes the edge very clean. So just like before, we'll attach sandpaper with double-sided tape and wet sand from 80 grit to 2000, or possibly starting from 120 depending on how much wood you need to remove. To me, the classiest part of any shamisen is a clean sawari edge. When the light catches just right, the straight line looks so beautiful, and it is possible to sand freehand. But if we want to ensure an amazing clean edge, the best way is to make a guide rail. Our guide rail is going to be made from 2 blocks of straight hardwood with a threaded bolt on either side using 2 lock washers, nuts, and wing nuts. There will also be a cushion between the underside of the tenjin and the bottom block. First, ensure the length of the hardwood extends past the width of the chibukuro by at least 2 centimeters. More is better. Then, with a pencil, make 2 marks on either side of the tenjin. This is where you'll drill 2 holes. Make sure there's distance between the holes and the sides of the tenjin so the metal screws don't accidentally scratch the wood. Clamp the blocks together and drill the 2 holes. Then, feed the lock washer through the screws and slide the screws through 1 block. Then, thread the nuts through the screws until they're snug against the wood. This will prevent the screws from falling out of the holes. For the cushion, you can use a towel, sponge, weather stripping, anything to add a soft layer. Place the cushion block on the underside of the tenjin. Then put the other block on top of the tenjin and through the screws, and tighten it down with wing nuts. Ideally, you have washers on this side as well, but I didn't have longer screws and was too lazy to go to the hardware store. But hey, the wood is hard and the guide rail doesn't need to be super tight. And with that, our guide rail is made and ready to be positioned. First, let's draw a line exactly in the middle between the 2 pencil lines. This is where we want the middle of our sanding block to be. It seems simple enough to eyeball, but because the margins are so tight, it's easy to be off by just a millimeter. And so drawing a line is the best way to ensure correct guide rail placement. If you notice the middle of the block is off of the middle line, loosen the guide rail and adjust until corrected. Then, to be doubly safe, take a ruler and measure the distance from one end of the pencil line to the guide rail and do the same to the other end. The distance should be exactly the same, which ensures the guide rail is perfectly parallel to the line. Recheck the position with the rounded block to make sure it's still in the middle. This might take a while to line them correctly, but it's worth it if you're into the visuals. Rushing this step can result in the edge line being slightly askew from the edge line of the chibukuro, and trying to correct that can be very time consuming. Once you've ensured your guide rail is aligned, wet the wood and start sanding. Check the progress of your edge often. Remember, you'll still need to fine sand, and the grits from 120 to 400 can quickly remove wood. Thus, once your edge is about a millimeter from the pencil line, start switching to the finer grit sandpapers. A few passes at 120, 220, all the way up to 2000. By the last paper, the edges should end up right on the line. Okay, the sawari tani and sao have been finally sanded to 2000. It's time for finishing. Now there's two methods we can use, oil or urushi. First, let's check out the oil method. Put camellia oil or olive oil on a soft cloth and rub it into the wood. Let the oil soak in, take a moment to enjoy the beauty, and when it's fully absorbed, apply another 2 coats, allowing time for the oil to absorb between each coat. Then we need migako, which is a soft, fine powder used for polishing. Applying migako is a simple matter of dabbing a very, very small amount on your palm and rubbing it on the wood. A very important tip about application, the powder only needs to kiss the wood's surface to be effective. More than that just fills up the grain. Firmly rub your palm into the wood in order to polish. Then you can use a piece of lambskin to rub off any residual powder. So that was the oil method. Now we'll check out urushi, the traditional Japanese lacquer. Now, urushi is highly allergenic, so please do plenty of research. Understand the risks of using it, your own sensitivity to the allergens, and the necessary precautions to safely use it. With that said, I'll demonstrate the fuki-urushi method, which I also recommend researching in depth. There's many shops that sell fuki-urushi kits and have everything you need for this process. First, I mix seshime urushi with turpentine in a 1:1 ratio. Then I rub it into the wood, ensuring that I've coated every part of the sao worked on. The top surface, shibukuro, sawari tani, and if you've sanded it, the area just above the edge of the itokura. Then we take our non-woven fabric. I recommend using the non-woven fabric sold by urushi craft shops, as I believe they're specifically made for urushi works. With a little bit of force, rub the fabric over the wood in a buffing motion to wipe the urushi and leave no streaks. Next, urushi requires humidity to cure, so we'll be putting our sao in a box with a wet cloth inside. If you're curing a mitsuri sao, the pieces can easily be placed in a storage box with a wet cloth. For nobe sao like this, you need to make a long box to hold and support the sao. With the sao in the box and the lid closed, we'll let it cure overnight. Next day, repeat the same process to add one more coat and let that cure overnight, or until it's dry to the touch. After it's dry, put a light dusting of migako on your palm, and just like before, use your palm or a piece of soft lambskin to buff the migako until you achieve a mirror-like polish. Finally, take a polishing paste like kikumo, apply it to the wood, and briskly buff it off with a polishing cloth. Take a look at that brilliant shine. Oh my. And there we go. The Kanberi repair process is complete. Seeing how it looked before, it's clear what a difference this process can make.
Even for a shamisen with much less wear, a good resurfacing is essential for making a used shamisen play like a brand new banger.
Lastly, you've seen what a difference the repair makes visually. Now, how about we hear the difference? Our dear friend Patrick Bighouse sent us his Kanberi worn shamisen for replaning.
Unlike this shamisen with one long gouge through it, his shamisen has much more common Kanberi present on the frequently used positions, so it will be perfect for a before and after comparison.
Let's have a listen.
Now, I'll pull the strings to the side and we can hear the sound of my fingernail against the sole. Rough stuff. And now for the wood scratch test. I'm scratching the same area that had Kanberi before. Nice.
So how long does it take to do the whole process?
Good question. With the lacquering or finishing not a factor, the planing and polishing takes about an hour when you're experienced. Initially, it took me about 5 hours of planing, finding out that I made a bump I didn't mean to, and then fixing that, making another bump, fixing that, etc. So if you're planning on doing this Kanberi repair process yourself, it would be safe to expect it to take maybe 3 to 5 hours.
Well, that's good to know. Now you know.